Thanks for tuning in to Stay Sharp with Razorleaf, your secret weapon for all things digital and manufacturing. In this episode, we continue the conversation with Michael Craffey on the relevance of infrastructure when managing enterprise systems. Mike explains how important it is to know your requirements. How many environments will you need? Is there ITAR compliance? What about performance? Do you know how your zones will affect product usage over different geographies? Mike notes, infrastructure goes beyond hardware and networks too, and must factor in people. Let's listen in with Mike, Jonathan, and Jen, and get the details you need to be prepared in your infrastructure plan for enterprise systems.
Welcome back to Stay Sharp, everybody, the podcast about all things digital related to products and manufacturing. In an earlier episode, we had discussed whether or not, after all the changes we've seen over the years, if infrastructure was still relevant to PLM. And if you haven't seen that episode yet, be sure to check it out. I'm not going to let you know the answer to that. But because that conversation was so informative, we decided to welcome back our friend and colleague, Mike Craffey. Mike has been implementing PLM systems for almost 2 decades here at Razorleaf, and over that time has worked on countless PLM projects from on-prem to cloud and everything in between. And I am joined today in our interview with Mike by my colleague and co-host, Jonathan Scott.
Hi, everybody.
Mike, before we jump in, can you give our listeners a bit about yourself? Tell them a bit about yourself and your work here at Razorleaf.
Sure. Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Jonathan. I've been with Razorleaf for a little over 18 years. And in that time, I've been doing project management and consulting and those sorts of things. And over the past several years, maybe even 5 years, my focus has kind of swung over to infrastructure and spending a bit more time and standing up environments and working with customers, standing up their environments, working with our consultants, helping them understand, how infrastructure gets put together. And then before I came to Razorleaf, I pretty much did the same thing for around 20 years. So I've seen infrastructure change over almost 40 years. So there's been really big changes over that time span.
Well, I think one of the things that we talked about in that first podcast was how it's been changing, and even some of what's been changing is the type of infrastructure that you have, where it's located. So can we start there?
Sure. Yeah. In our previous episode, we talked about, hey, 40 years ago, where was your data center? Data center was probably in your building, in your server room, in that server room that's freezing cold. And, you just had a local area network. You didn't have a WAN or, maybe, 10 years along, you had a more sophisticated network where you had a couple of LANs tied together with a WAN, and you had multiple facilities. But essentially, the infrastructure was your infrastructure on your equipment in your facility, managed by your people. And, fast forwarding to today, that has continued to morph into co-located data centers or completely on the cloud, either AWS or Azure or even any rack space if you wanted physical servers, managed by a third party. So infrastructure will continue to morph over time, and even new companies. We'll talk about this later in our show here today. When new technology comes out, it tends to take advantage of the newest infrastructure and the newest changes in infrastructure. So, 20 years ago, when you thought about, architecting a new platform, you didn't necessarily think about, well, are they going to use, their iPhone or their iPad or a tablet, to interface with my stuff, and today, you have to actually start there. Hey, is this going to be a mobile platform?
I think that's a great place to start, Mike. I mean, to dive into this, I think you have to begin with requirements, right? What do people need when you're thinking about your infrastructure and you're trying to figure out what does your infrastructure look like for, say we're talking to the whole broad audience of what we're interested in on this podcast, anything digital related to products. All right, whether it's ERP, MES, PLM, CAD, any of those things, what do you need? What do you require, right? There might be some requirements like, I have to access it over the network, or I have to get to it remotely, or, there might be hard and fast requirements. And then there might be, as the government likes to call them, desirements, right? The wants, the wishes also, requirements and desirements. But that's where we have to start, right? Is you got to think about what are you trying to do that might then shape what you need or what your options are in terms of these infrastructure things. So, when you think about that, when you challenge customers to think about their requirements and their preferences and those kinds of things, I mean, what comes to mind? What are some of the big topics there?
Right. Yeah. Well, depending on where the company is and their sort of maturation of, their IT and their handle on, technology and whatnot, because it varies quite widely. In fact, you might have a company you're working with that is very qualified IT people, but they're very good and very knowledgeable about on-prem systems, and maybe now they have a requirement that this system needs to be on the cloud, and so now all of a sudden you have a whole laundry list of things that you never even considered before, related to the network infrastructure. What kind of performance do you need in that network, or even what kind of performance do you need, out of your cloud infrastructure? Storage capacity is not necessarily about size, although size is important, but the speed of your storage is also important. And you have a whole plethora of choices on the cloud, and I guess I really want 20,000 IOPS because that's faster. Well, if your application can't use 20,000 IOPS, you're paying for something that you really don't need.
Right. Or you have 20,000 IOPS on the app and you're connecting to the cloud via dial-up.
Still not going to achieve the
I got a 10 megabit connection, right?
Yep. Right. But and you mentioned something else. Sorry I interrupted. While I've interrupted, I'm gonna keep going with something you mentioned a minute ago. Where do you want it? Sometimes it's where does it have to be, right? Back to that requirement versus just wish thing. But sometimes it's just a wish. Companies are like, well, my IT group wants me to get to the cloud. We want to be cloud first. Well, is that a requirement? Or is that if it makes sense and find a balance because, I found this, MES system that's great, but it's not cloud enabled. And I found this other one that's a cloud-based MES, but I don't really like it. How do you weigh that? So people have to think about, is it requirement, wish, where does it fit, that kind of thing. But your point is there's things there to think about.
Yeah. Well, not only that, you reminded me of a session I gave at Co last year about, how many environments do you need?
Right.
And what are those environments? And the things that people don't tend to think about is, well, if I have a desirement to be on the cloud, all right, well then, how's your licensing going to work? Mm-hmm. How are you going to secure it? Are you going to just let anybody in there? What if you have, foreign nationals that need to access your system? How are you going to handle that? And so there's a whole gamut of questions that people don't necessarily think about that all of a sudden become, when somebody started out saying, oh, that's a requirement, to, well, do you have ITAR requirements?
Yep.
Okay. Well, you can do cloud, but now you got to go to the Gov Cloud section.
Yeah. And if you're not in the US, right, there's, I can't remember the word. Is it sovereign, right? Sovereign cloud things. Yep.
Right. And I've learned, that some of the services, their .gov offerings aren't as fully featured as their non.gov offerings. And so, the things things that I got used to seeing in the public cloud offering, and all of a sudden I pivot over to the Gov cloud, and they don't have that option here, and it's like, now I got to put this architecture together a little bit differently.
But there's probably other things. You mentioned kind of like where. That's an easy requirement or desirement. Where do you need it? Some things about performance. What do you need out of your WAN? Maybe there's probably other things too, right? Like cloud zones. I mean, what else is there performance wise? You mentioned storage, other stuff.
That's right. I mean, there's a couple things that come to mind. Zones you brought up. I mean, that's kind of an important one. If you have maybe a solution that you've put on, let's just say AWS, and you put it in the West Zone, but you've got 500 users in the east, on the east side of the Mississippi River. Well, you may not have thought about having any kind of replication, or maybe a closer file store, or whatever it happens to be. So those people, speed of light, they still have to access that system. It's on the West Coast or wherever it happens to be in the West Zone, because you can't really determine like where those servers are going to be. And if your licensing is being offered, and your license servers on the East Coast, those East Coast people are accessing the system on the West Coast, and then their licensing's over on the East Coast. And so you have this big, huge, latency that's built in that you didn't really think about. I didn't think about that, and so those things can be overcome, but you need to plan for it.
Right.
And of course, the other big one, the where and the what, and is the budget. There'll be things, like I said, about overpaying for IOPS. I mean, all these things are sort of budget.
Sure, anything's possible if you have unlimited funds.
Enough money.
That's right. There's an interesting angle on that too, that I think some of our listeners may key right in on. As we're talking about infrastructure and budget, don't forget that when you shift to this model of cloud or even hosting, sometimes you can actually start to work with your finance group to look at things differently, because paying for a service monthly can look like an expense, whereas buying a server looks like a piece of capital, and it's got to go in a certain budget, be treated a certain way, certain levels of approvals. I think we might have talked about this in another episode somewhere, right? About how there's a proliferation of cloud tools around digitalization today. And it's one of the reasons, one of the drivers, right? Is you can stick your credit card in and you're using it right now, right? And that's some ways it's because it's an expense, right? It's just like, I picked up a pen at the office supply store. I've got some cloud PLM. Good, let's go. But on your point though, Mike, about these choices, these requirements, budget's a requirement. And it can fit into these other requirements in interesting ways that, I want to do that on-prem, or I need to do that in cloud, or I need to, however you might go about it, because it's just a connected requirement in some ways.
Right. Well, I mean, like Jen asked the question, is infrastructure still a topic that people think about, and cloud actually starts to bump up against, no. Infrastructure is not relevant anymore. If I need another server, I'll just go put the credit card in. I got another server. So in some ways, infrastructure could be, especially if you have people who really understand what it is that they're provisioning, how it gets provisioned, when it gets provisioned. If you're using infrastructure as code, you can just, hey, we need to spin up a system for 10 days. All right, well, here, go run this script. And it builds all the infrastructure, and it gets turned on, and it's on for 10 days, and they just destroy it. I think you probably save tens of thousands of dollars by doing it that way than, spinning up servers. And of course, cloud also allows you to have systems that, we're done testing. Okay, we'll just power those down, and then you're just paying your monthly fee to have it,
right.
$10 or $20 or whatever per server.
To your point about, is it still relevant though, right? I mean, you can't make that argument both ways in the same time, right? Like you said, it doesn't matter, just spin up another server, right? So it's really not relevant. But yet it is, to your point, you could save a lot of money doing it one way versus another. So it can be very relevant. And likewise, it also gets you into trouble. But, as we're talking through these requirements, and you mentioned ITAR, well, did you put it in the cloud in the right way? Oh, yeah, I put that in the cloud, and then I put sensitive data on it, and it turns out it was all over the world, and I was violating all kinds of export controls. All right, that was not good. That's very relevant. I'm going to jail. Not good.
Right. Yeah. Or even if it's just your IP,
right?
And you don't secure your IP. I mean, I'm not saying that Amazon or Azure is not secure, because it is secure. But if you don't know who's accessing the data
or what you're doing with it,
you have
right. I mean, I heard
when you're done with it.
Well, not even when you're done with it, but while you're standing it up, right? I heard a story from an IT person, no names here because this is terrible, but it was, hey, yeah, I got a storage bucket on Amazon and I put some data up there, and it turns out it wasn't an anonymous bucket. So it was actually open publicly, and they just didn't realize it. They weren't educated about what they were doing. It was easy, quick, put the credit card in, and lo and behold, and I think if I remember the story right, it was about, personal data, personally identifiable data that an IT firm had put database of, credit card numbers or something. It's like, I'm just storing it to transfer it, but they didn't realize it was exposed. So yeah, it's very relevant.
we kind of laugh about it, but it is really easy when you start thinking of infrastructure as being relevant or irrelevant. I mean, you can make mistakes, and it's an honest mistake, because it's, the complexity is obscured by pushing a button. Mm-hmm. It's so easy. You push a button, and well, what did you just do? And
and that could be said about a lot of things. Right? There's so much focus on ease of use and packing so much information and knowledge into whether it's the application, the infrastructure, et cetera, that the important things get glossed over. And I think that's kind of what, like when we were talking in our last episode about this topic, it was, infrastructure. Sorry I said I wasn't going to say this. Infrastructure is still relevant, but it's the definition of infrastructure and how its relevance has changed.
And I'll make one more point about it's real easy or whatever. There's a period of time when we were talking about or moving companies, to co-located servers or cloud, and companies just would not even talk about it. Mm-hmm. Hey, how, do you have any problem with putting this on the cloud? Oh no, it's our IP. I mean, you make marbles. Yeah, but it's our IP. So there was a lot of fear, around, and it was well founded. Hey, we don't understand how to secure our data. So therefore we're not going to put it out there, and that's perfectly fine. And you should work with professionals when you're dealing with this, especially if you don't know the answers. Mm-hmm. Or you should at least discover it together, because having other people who understand, or have been through this, stub their toes enough, can help you not stub your toe.
So let's say you figured out requirements, right? To that point, you understand what you need. You're educated enough to say, I have to have this. I think I want that. These are my preferences. Or even if it's not you, the person owning the project or doing it, but maybe you've worked with your IT group to understand their preferences. Oh, we're cloud first. Don't have to be, but that's what whatever that might be. So what are the options these days, right? I mean, I know that's a broad question. We only have a 30-minute episode, but what are the things that get controlled through some of those requirements that you have options on today?
Yeah. Well, I think that you've got your obvious options, right? On-prem or cloud, and we'll just frame it that way. I can put it on the cloud, or I can keep it in my data center. Then you have, in addition to those requirements we just talked about, a company might be going through some sort of a right sizing, or, hey, we're trying to decrease our infrastructure costs. And so there's a business need that maybe we didn't think about when we were going through our requirements. We were talking to the manufacturing and the engineering people, and, hey, when we got to the IT folks, they were like, well, yeah, we can't put another blade in our data center. Mm-hmm. We've hit the ceiling on, hardware or whatever infrastructure we'll say. Because infrastructure is not just the hardware and the networks, it's the people that have to support it. And so, I think that's one of the things that drive the decision, but maybe not as much as it used to. Certainly data sensitivity will drive you it'll drive you away from public cloud, and either force you into gov cloud or back into your data center. And even if you have to move it back to your data center, you probably have some options that maybe you didn't think about previously with virtual machines and things of that nature, which most companies very few companies just have physical servers anymore. I mean, everybody's got virtual servers. And then, but if you can do cloud, I mean, cloud offers some really nice flexibility, things we already talked about, like, I just need a temporary system for a while, a solution. Or I just, hey, I'm doing a migration and I need 6 extra servers for 6 months. And then when I'm done, I'm just going to shut those off. So that's some flexibility that you really can't get, on-prem, unless your on-prem solutions are, hey, we think about our infrastructure as an enterprise infrastructure, that all of our solutions are in this infrastructure. So it used to be, ERP has their stuff, mm-hmm. PLM has their stuff, and CRM has their stuff, and accounting has their stuff. Well, not anymore. I think you could have the same virtual infrastructure and have all those solutions sort of commingled inside of that infrastructure. And you could get some economies of scale there instead of having all this separated infrastructure.
That's what I was thinking about when you mentioned a couple of different technologies over time, Mike. Like, you mentioned adding a blade to the server, right, or adding a server to the rack or whatever it is, and then there's this idea of, well, we have a bunch of shared infrastructure, so it's adding a VM, adding a virtual machine, but I've got this larger pool inside my data center that lets me do that. That lets it be flexible and scalable, and then the cloud is the ultimate in scalability, right? Which is anything I need, just, put the credit card in and add whatever you want, and it's instantly available. But I think put those three together and it gives you an interesting picture of a trend and some data points that are worth thinking about, right? As people think about infrastructure and what they might do today and what they might be able to do tomorrow, or what might be coming, or where we're headed. You know what I mean? I mean, if you go back to, 20 years ago, it was, can you add another server to the rack? Do you have space? Do you have capacity to scale whatever you're doing? But you thought about it within certain bounds. Do I have room in the engineering server? Because it was very siloed. And then you get to virtualization and people said, wait, we can pool resources across groups and our IT group can help us do that. And so it's almost like you had this mini cloud in your own data center where you had all this capacity, but you could allocate it across different groups, functions, needs, whatever it might be with your virtualization. And then now we've gotten to the point where, okay, it's not just inside your data center. That virtualization is taken to a whole nother level, right, in the cloud where scale however you want. But what does that mean, right? What does that mean for the future? I don't know. I mean, you have any thoughts on that? Like, where are we going with scalability?
Well, that's a good question, and I'll answer that a couple different ways. One is, if you've ever stood up a virtual machine on a cloud platform, you'll get some options, right? You'll have, like, I'll say 6 different machine types, and they all have this one's CPU optimized, this one's storage optimized, this one's compute optimized, or whatever it happens to be. And that's just the provider, trying to give you, some parameters that you want to work in. And then you can choose, I want this one because it has, 24 cores and, 128 gigs of RAM or whatever it happens to be. But what you have available to you on prem, if you're doing virtualization, is the ability to say, like you just talked about, Jonathan, having all this commingled resources, is the ability to say, oh, I have, these hosts, these server hosts, and they just have X number of cores and X amount of RAM and X amount of storage. And then I can create virtual machines with whatever I require, right? I need 6 cores here, and I need 8 cores there, and I need this much RAM. I can determine exactly what I want. I can dial it in, where cloud doesn't necessarily give you that fine of control.
Right.
I know many of them have, if I choose this server and I want, let's just say it's 8 cores and 32 gigs, and I want to increase it for whatever reason. And that's a good thing. It allows you, you know what? We undersized it. Okay. Well, let's just step it up. Well, what you're going to get is 16 cores and 64 gigs. Right. They double like that, and of course the price changes, and so it's kind of like a bait and switch, but it gives you the ability to, now they do have some bursting controls. Like if you just temporarily need some stuff, and you can enable burst and you'll get a charge, but it's not like doubling.
But it's interesting you bring that up, right? It's the difference between discrete options and everything within your control, right? To your point, if you've bought the capacity and it's in your data center, you could twiddle with the knobs however you want to get to exactly what you need. And similarly, specialized things. I think that's very relevant in the space we're talking about, right? I mean, I know cloud providers have GPU optimized machines now, right? So you can do graphics intensive applications in the cloud. But some people still are, hey, what I want is a VDI solution. I want it in my data center because they want, like you said, to sort of twiddle with the knobs. I want to really dial it into exactly what I want. I need one instance that's, 12 gigs of video RAM, and then I want 10 more instances that are 2 gigs each. And if I buy the right card and blah, blah, they can do all that. But it's a different kind of scalability and control.
Right. Well, I mean, so to answer your question a little more specifically about the future, what I think is probably going to happen. I mean, you just talked about GPUs, and GPUs to us as engineers, we think of GPUs. Oh, hey, we need something that'll run this GPU intensive, design application, or it's gaming or whatever. But now you have things like, is this AI based? Is this, this nonlinear, algorithm I need is really GPU optimized. And so you'll have those things. But I think in the future, you'll have maybe 2 things that are going to occur. One is the ability to fine control that, to dial it up and down.
Right.
There's no reason why they wouldn't offer it. I'm sure it's going to come. But I also think maybe you might have the ability. I mentioned the burst ability, and I think that we could have a situation where the cloud vendors get sophisticated enough, or maybe if you combine it with AI, get sophisticated enough to predict when you're going to need that burst, or over time it realizes that, in 3 months you're going to need 12 cores instead of 8, or you're going to need 48 gigs of RAM instead of 32, based on the trends that it's seeing. So we're going to see AI coupled with cloud, and then have this flexible infrastructure, or evolving or morphing infrastructure based on use.
Further optimization of the load, right? Beyond kind of what we manually optimize today.
That's an interesting way to bring AI into the conversation. It makes perfect sense. It really does.
I want to come back to something about this, the scaling and those kinds of optimization I think is particularly poignant right now in the space that we work in. And that's about architecture and how it can and can't take advantage of some of this, right? Because infrastructure, I look at cloud infrastructure and some of the things you just mentioned. I mean, it's going crazy. The things that are popping up every day, it's like, wow, okay. And I think about how we take advantage of it in this this product digitalization space we work in and some of the enterprise apps we work with. I mean, are they all there? Are they all ready to take advantage? If not, I mean, why not? What do you see about architecture as it relates to infrastructure, Mike?
Well, I think that there's a couple of things. One is mature companies, been around a long time. We see either the architecture being rewritten.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're changing it. We're gonna move away from, say, client server architecture to service oriented architecture. And actually there's a variant of SOA called microservices,
mm-hmm.
which is kind of a big thing. Or vendors who, built their applications with an assumption of what the architecture or the infrastructure was going to be, and then realize, well, no, our infrastructure needs to be, cloud ready or cloud oriented or however you want to say that. There are a few vendors out there that have, and I'll say in the PLM space,
mm-hmm.
that have a real, software as a service, architecture and can take advantage of all the things that cloud can provide. And I think that there are companies, I mentioned this earlier, if there's a company coming up with a new piece of software, they're probably going to orient their architecture towards taking advantage of cloud and all that implies.
And are you talking about
mobile devices?
Mike, when you talk about that, are you talking about containers and Kubernetes and that kind of thing?
It could be. I mentioned microservices, but it could be containerization of an application. So if you can imagine a container being just a self-contained application that is platform independent. I just need some place to execute this thing. And, we need to stand up an environment, or we need to go through, again, rapid DevOps, development. And, the way we're going to do that is taking advantage of containerization and not having to worry about, does that server have the right OS on it, or, whatever it happens to be. It's already contained, and all you need to have is some compute, to execute it on. Again, it's coming, it's out there. But if you're an established vendor, containerizing your application might be harder than you think.
Yeah.
Versus if it's, brand new technology, they're going to tend to be there, to be using that technology.
I think that brings an interesting implication, about that question of architecture and infrastructure and how the two, fit together or matter. A lot of startup vendors, right? In our PLM's a great example. Let's take that and run with it. Startup vendors, cloud vendors, they're doing this containerization. It's the way they're writing the app from the ground up. So they're just doing it. And their stuff can just scale with the cloud, right? So it's like, all right, yeah, here's the tech today. I'll write it on the tech today, and off we go. You back up a little bit and you look at, all right, so the legacy vendors, what did they do? You mentioned a couple of terms that I think are relevant, again, in this kind of data points that helps us see a trend. All right, let's take a real legacy PLM app, maybe that was client server, right? And the way that thing worked is you wrote a thick client that ran in Windows or Unix. It talked to the server, and the server talked to the database, or maybe it talked to the database directly, but those were a couple components, right? And that's how it was wired. It was meant for the LAN, and it's not ready for, internet security.
One location.
It's ready for one location. It's not ready for internet security. It's not ready for any of that. So, let's say 30 years ago, vendors who wrote that then said, oh, wait, we need wide area networks. And so they made the network links work over wide area network protocols and HTTP. And all right, now it can work over the internet, maybe still via VPN. But, all right, so they changed their architecture, right? Nice. And then they said, oh, wait, maybe now what I need is, an N-tier architecture, database, presentation, web services. and then they said, all right, I need this, and it got them to service-oriented architecture. And so that helps them scale and put different services on different servers. And each one of these was kind of this evolution, maybe for different reasons, for performance, security, scaling, ability to, like you said, faster DevOps, different things. But in each case, they were taking a legacy app and they needed to move it forward. And that takes a while versus somebody who jumped in, let's just pick 10 years ago. Somebody who jumped in brand new probably made an N-tier SOA-based application. Well, now they're the legacy. And so they've got to try and get their stuff to the containerization world. And I mean, are we just going to keep seeing this, you think? And what does it mean to people and their requirements?
That's exactly right. I think what you made me think about, because I'm an old guy, is applications that were developed before the internet had a certain architecture. And you had applications developed after the internet had another type of architecture. And then after cloud was another type of architecture. Your guess is as good as mine where this is going in the future. But you see things, where we're moving our storage to this algae farm over here, and we're doing biological based storage, and that's what we're doing. And so, why is that, outlandish or remarkable to anyone? That you would have the future be, the cloud is, in some, obscure data center somewhere. It doesn't have to be only there. It could be almost anywhere. But again, today, the things that we're looking at are the things we just talked about. Containerization, microservices, and microservices are really just taking a bunch of loosely coupled applications and having them use lightweight communication to communicate with one another. And that's very powerful, especially if you're going to load up, your automobile with a bunch of applications. You can put them on microservices within the architecture of your vehicle. I mean, nobody thought about, I'm going to design my application so it runs inside of a Tesla. We didn't think about that stuff, but now you almost have to. Is it going to, what application is going to run inside your fridge? Yeah. Your displays up there. Yeah. We think about those things. We laugh about it, but it is, it's your television, it's your Alexa, it's whatever.
Yep. Wow. That's a lot to think about.
Yeah. And when does cloud only stay out on cloud? Eventually I think it's going to be funny when we have, a data center, and there are some vendors that offer this that I know of. They will take a hunk of their cloud iPaaS, their infrastructure as a service, and they will, put it into an appliance and stick it in your data center, and then they will manage it.
Yep.
That's now you've just taken the cloud from the cloud and put it into your data center. You've extended your data center. You've allowed the cloud to come into your data center.
Yeah. I've seen that with a few customers, right? I looked at this a couple of years ago. I don't know if they still call it this, but Amazon had something called Snowball that was that. And I remember, I won't get into you can guess the industry, but a government customer who wanted to say, look, I need a scalable, flexible data center, but I know somebody else who does it. I don't really want to do it. And, they were saying, that's how I want to run some of this digital product stuff. And you can imagine there are places that it's hard to put a data center, but you want one that's resilient, scalable, flexible, all those things. And yeah, to your point, maybe it'll be on an algae farm.
Right. And then if you start thinking about different industries, just drive down to your local, automotive service center, and they have all kinds of technology in there. And those auto service centers are not they don't stand alone. Mm-hmm. They're connected to a bunch of other ones. And, so their infrastructure needs are not so different than a manufacturing company. And you think, oh, it's just the Avis rental car place. Well, their infrastructure is national or global, or don't even get into the airline industry. I mean, how do they connect things together? I mean, that's great, and it's got to be instantaneous too.
Jen, do we just have Mike on
you
to
can't wait
scare
15
us?
minutes for
I don't know. I'm.
What's that?
I asked if we just have you on to scare us, or what?
Yeah, I'm starting to wonder. I'm like, okay, now we're talking about algae farms and like how everything's connected and bringing clouds inside. I don't know. It's.
I know we could probably keep going for hours, and I could ask you goofy questions that people would be like, okay, turn this thing off. But the one that's on my mind before we wrap up today, and Jen, you're probably being nice not to say, hey, Jonathan, stop asking questions.
No, it's, this is one of the ones that I'm just listening to, largely fascinated by both of your conversations. So you're all good.
But we talked, when we were planning this, there's some cats and dogs I want to get to, right? I mean, even if we only have time just to kind of mention them, but stuff that relates to infrastructure that maybe we haven't talked about, whether it's requirements or the capabilities or that sort of thing. I mean, what else do you see that's maybe worth noting before we wrap up?
Sure. Well, a couple of things come to mind. One is, things like augmented reality, thrown on a set of goggles or whatever, and being able to interact with your product.
Because that's hardware, right? We're talking about infrastructure.
It's infrastructure. That's hardware, and it's sophisticated. You just can't just plug that into anything and it's gonna work. And so years and years ago, we laugh about hardware. Hey, what kind of space mouse do you have? Or what kind of tablet do you use with your CAD application? If you had a tablet and a space mouse, you were
a really big geek, is what you were.
Yeah, you're a really big geek. And so you have those sorts of things. Or if you have something super sophisticated, which you see, which is having a VR cave, where people interact with a life-size, full-scale model of your. It could even be, a surgery-based, thing where you want to have a surgery center and be able to go check out your endoscopic equipment, virtually. So those things are real, and that's part of your infrastructure as well.
Right. And people, and they're when you say they're real, and they're getting to the point where more people can have them, right? It's not just 3 people worldwide that have them. It's other people go and see it, say, I want one of those. How much does one cost? And it's viable, and people are doing it, right? And we're seeing them show up with customers, and it's a different kind of infrastructure, right?
Right. And it's funny though, how you see things happen, let's just say in the gaming world, where things tend to move at a frenetic pace. And so, people are using goggles and interacting in virtual ways, even interacting with each other. And so that type of infrastructure and that type of technology will make its way into, a manufacturing company.
Oh, sure.
Too. I mean, there's no reason why it wouldn't. And if you can imagine, they have a very sophisticated, and as products get more and more sophisticated, have a very sophisticated, assembly process for putting things together. Hey, go in the cave, slap on your goggles. You're going to walk through, the process, and it's going to be virtual, and we're going to time you and make sure our tact times are right, things of that nature. So,
manufacturing or repair or, you name it, right?
Let's get into the medical space. I mean, practicing surgery is a real thing. And it's, to your point, as far as being affordable, it's, it's getting to the point that it's more affordable to have a training facility like that, a virtual training facility, than it is to actually practice on, having people there practicing on cadavers, because you can see so much more in a virtual space than you can.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we should ask the aerospace industry, back to your airline thing, Mike, right? I mean, how many years ago did the aircraft makers decide that flight simulators were a much better use than
crashing?
Let's go fly it and see how it works?
Yeah, well, now they have those requirements. You have to spend, X number of hours in a simulator before we put you in a $35 million, aircraft.
Right. And things they can do in the simulator, like you were saying about surgery, Jen, that you can't do with a cadaver. You can't do with a real aircraft. You can't, it's well, hey, we're in the software world still. We're teaching you about this, but we've got more capabilities here because we can control it.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. We know you crashed the aircraft. All right, start over again. Push the button. Start again.
You survived. It's all good. Didn't cost anything. Reset.
That's how my experience went. All right, I'm going to tell a story. Went to a customer. They made flight simulators. They let me fly one. It was awesome. Full motion, big, right? So I'm there, and I was there with another consultant from our team, and he was a pilot. So, we got in. They said, all right, scenarios, we're going to put you up in the air. We're going to let you land, right? So the buddy gets in the cockpit, sits down, lands the plane. It's great. Awesome. We're all sitting there behind him, moving in the simulator. It was fantastic. All right, your turn. I get up there, sit down. I think it was 3 minutes flat before I had the whole thing turned red. You can only imagine why. Amazing.
But it didn't cost anything, and everybody lived.
It didn't cost anything. No. So anything else, Mike, we should dig into? I mean, I feel like we've got to wrap up. We're probably way over the time we had targeted, but other things that you'd want to mention for folks to think about related to infrastructure that maybe isn't as obvious?
Some things that are we tend to push to the side, especially in cloud. I can't even think of a time when somebody on the cloud actually lost a server, like they had a cascade failure and lost everything. So, but backup and disaster recovery is something even if you're going to use cloud, and even if that cloud vendor is going to, give you an SLA of 99.9% uptime, which it probably will be, but you could have a scenario where, you have poor backup and recovery procedures in place, and you can have a malware attack. Mm-hmm. And so you have no way to get back, but if you still consider, if you couple, security and backup and disaster recovery together, then, hey, having a malware attack maybe is not that big a deal, especially if you have 4-hour window, snapshots that you can go back to. Can you stand losing 4 hours of productivity? Maybe it's an hour, maybe it's a day, maybe it's a week.
Right.
But certainly it's better than
it's
all
better
of it.
than yeah. No, we don't have a backup of that. That's a problem.
We've had that though, right? I mean, we've had customers that have had those kinds of accidents, mistakes, whatever you call it. And I think you bring up a really good point, Mike, which is, the reliability of some of these tools today. It's like the ease of use thing we mentioned earlier. It can give you a false sense of security. And it may be that, sure, you could trust that server is going to be there and it's never going to have a problem. Maybe that's perfect. But you can't count on the guy outside your facility not using a backhoe to dig up your WAN connection. All right, manufacturing's offline for how long now? Because you can't get to the cloud? So that whole point, backup and disaster recovery, it's probably the same point it's always been, which is think about your points of failure and have strategies for each of them. Don't get lulled into, but it's on the cloud. I've got an SLA. It'll be fine. Well, that'll be fine, but that might not be everything you need to use that asset.
That's exactly right. I mean, if you understand where your points of failure are and how those points of failure will impact your operation, then at least everybody's eyes are wide open and you've had a conversation about okay, how do we mitigate that? Well, we can't, there's no mitigation for that. Okay, fine. Then we know that. And so then you can have things like Jonathan mentioned about somebody, broke, dug up the fiber connection. Well, you might have other controls. Hey, if there's going to be any kind of construction around our facility, we have to have, 2-day limits on, call before you dig. No, it's got to be 48 hours and we have to, clearly mark where all these things are at. And, you have other controls to sort of prevent that single point of failure. Where maybe you hadn't even thought about that. Oh yeah, our fiber runs under the building and somebody just dug a hole in there and cut it.
Yeah. Or redundancies. But I mean, the important thing is, plan, right? That's, if we just tie it back to infrastructure in general, any of these things, if it's a capability you need, think about What happens if it goes away? How could it go away? How do you mitigate that? And how bad is it if it does go away? Which might inform how much time and effort you want to spend coming up with a backup plan. But that's the approach. If you take that philosophy, you don't get surprised. But I think the point that you're bringing up by saying, "Hey, this is one not to forget," is don't get lulled into a false sense of security because how easy some of this stuff has become or can be. It's still real. You need to pay attention to that resiliency point.
And you could point to another thing about backup and disaster recovery. It wasn't that long ago. It's been 20 years, I guess, now, when we had the big grid outage here in the Northeast. And now you see lots of businesses, they still have those semis out back with the big Cummins generators still sitting there.
Yeah, because that problem hasn't gone away. That's for sure.
No, and it won't. But it's amazing some of the places that I did see those that no longer are there. So they're like, it's been okay. And so they're lulled back into that. Oh, that never happened again.
So one question, I know we're supposed to be wrapping up, but it seems like one of the last things that people think about in general when you're talking about technology and infrastructure, and it's the people side of things, right? So it's training and support, and people are always the last that would consider, but they should not be.
They shouldn't be.
Well, that's because people are harder than technology, I think.
People are always getting tangled up in the machinery. Yeah, but it's a good point. I mean, especially if you're making a big shift, from on-prem to on cloud, you could nominate some people internally to start looking at, like, how does this going to change? Everybody's their day-to-day activities are, oh wow, we're not, we're going to be in the cloud. Oh, what does that mean? Oh, COVID drove everybody home, and so we had this initiative to be cloud ready. And so now we're cloud ready, and we can move to, you can work from home 2 or 3 days a week and only be in the office for 2 days, but you still have that aspect of security and those sorts of things. So there could be things that are good for people, but you have to prepare for that. Like you said, Jen, training and support. If all of a sudden, 50% of your workforce is at home on a Wednesday and, something hiccups, those people are going to be like, well, I'm going to go to the mall now, or, I'm going to go for a walk, because the system's down, so those are things that you have to sort of consider. But the people aspect of it, there can be good things about it, and there can be certainly bad things about it. I know for me, because we have the ability to, we've always been working from home.
Right.
The downside is that you're always working. And
I'm in sales, so that's always the case.
That's right.
Yeah.
You never get to
have to wash it.
But you can, right. And you can do this. You can do it from anywhere, and so that's, it's a big deal, especially if you have an organization where you have, maybe I'm an engineer and there's 4 or 5 design centers in a geography, but I can move from design center to design center and actually be productive and work because our infrastructure, supports that ability. And so there's a people aspect to that, as well. Especially if your design center happens to be in like Sweden, and I can travel over to Stockholm and work from there.
I want to chime in on this one because I think that's a really interesting point that you've brought up, Jen, and I'm going to connect it back to something we talked about in other episodes, getting to organizational change, right? Is how do you help the organization change? And this can impact that. And I'm going to give you what I think is a fascinating change in a little infrastructure thing in the last, I'll say 10 years or so. Like you mentioned, Mike, we work from home. We work with lots of different clients, some more or less secure than others. And of course, the IT security landscape has changed over that time. I can think of clients that, used to give me RDP access to their servers right in their data center, over what I would call a pretty unsecure connection. I'm just typing away, logging in as admin and helping install software in their data center. Okay, that's scary today, but we did it. But it's so funny. There's been this evolution. We got mobile devices, we got cloud, we got all these things. And when we're working from home and over the pandemic, it was great, right? There were things you could do literally from your phone to still be working. And people do that today. And I've seen this go back the other direction some now. I find fascinating. So some of the more sensitive companies we work with, all right, it's always been a VPN. You got to have a virtual private network to get access into their system. And they want you to work in their system because that's where they have their security controls, whether it's cloud, data center, whatever. But they have their walled garden where they need you to work. Okay, cool. Well, first it was VPN. I put the VPN software on my Razorleaf laptop and get into their walled garden. Well, then it became, could you attack the VPN software? So they said, wait, no, I need to control the device on which the VPN runs. Okay, so we've gone sort of full circle between, well, isn't that convenient? I can do this from my own mobile phone to, now I've got...
Let me get out one of my stacks of laptops back here. And
I've got 3 different laptops sitting on my desk for 3 different customers where it's like, all right, I got to use this laptop for that customer. And, and it's back to this infrastructure point and tying it to training and organizational change. Every time something shifts, we got to adapt to it. Right. And when we do these things that maybe are for security or for performance or for whatever, we need to make time to plan for how does that impact people, right? Because I can't travel with 3 laptops for work, right? But did anybody think about that?
Well, you could. It would just be really inconvenient.
I hate being that guy at the airport. No, hold on. One more. No, one more.
Right.
Anyway.
Well, I think it's an interesting point that as infrastructure has expanded, as everything has, as the cloud has opened up, as it's really changing what we can do, how we can do it, where we can do it. It's, when you're talking about people's experience, it's changed it in significantly different ways, right? So the user experience has gotten, in a lot of ways, a whole lot easier. But then the responsibility on the organization to understand the infrastructure and the technology underneath all of that ease of use is, I think, gotten much higher. So there's a higher level of what you can do, but a higher level of responsibility to make sure that you do it correctly. Would that be fair to say?
That's a great point. That's a great point, John.
So, I mean, I know we have to wrap up. I feel like we might be back on this topic. There's still,
that's right. I want to dig into that one.
Right. I mean, we've covered damn near everything today. We've covered algae farms. We've covered flight simulators. We have gone through some of the things you need to think about when you're navigating today's infrastructure, preparing for tomorrow's infrastructure, things to think about. I'd like to hear from any of our listeners, anything that we didn't touch on or any topics that, questions that you have. Well, what about in this particular case? What would you recommend? Or have you thought about that? So if you have any comments or questions, reach out to us on social media, contact us via our website. Or if there's just something else you're really kind of tired of infrastructure now and you want to hear more about something else, please let us know. Make it a conversation. And I want to thank Mike for joining us again. Who knows?
Absolutely,
we might have you
Mike.
Back again. And
thank you for being here. This was good.
Yes. And Jonathan for being such a great co-host and, basically letting me just kind of be in the background today.
It's code for talking too much.
Exactly.
Okay. That's me.
Fine.
That's
it's
me.
All
Guilty.
Good. It's all good. And until next time, everybody, stay sharp.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for being here and listening to this episode of Stay Sharp with Razorleaf. If you have any lingering questions from this podcast, we'd love to answer it for you. Just leave a comment on our post or send an email to podcast@razorleaf.com. We appreciate all the feedback we receive. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, stay sharp.